Um, so I think I'm trying to control randomness. And the question I would ask you, the question I ask myself, is the thing you looked at not coherent?
Yeah.
And one of the discussions I have with my students is we can't quite decide yet the definition of coherency, but we can agree that it's not uncoherent.
No, it's coherent.
We
It's
go
just
on a reverse.
incongruent.
What?
It's highly coherent, but incongruent. In other words, the coherency don't have to do with the consanity of part to whole in harmonious relationships, which used to be, so you actually prefer the part to the whole, and you can produce a coherence out of a discordant ballet of parts. So it does all read
So the model I showed you that I was operating on, I can the local pieces with these guys, I could throw them out there, and then put another set and look at them. Well, finally I can't do that. They in fact are located by functionalities and shape language that accommodate certain things. They have to do with relationships that have to do with movement, with various functionalities, with site conditions, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always a negotiated thing.
Yeah, but when you put the
what
holes in
what looks like it's
Cincinnati,
random, and which in fact has other parameters that are forcing it. To me, it'd be more like a walk through the forest. The structure of a particular rock, of a grass, of a fern, of 3 different tree types, of the river, all of them have their own properties and their own characteristics and are operating over time. They have a dynamic over a seasonal variation, and they have dynamic over the various forces that they operate under, right? Geological, climatological, et cetera. And that they're absolutely coherent, but they don't operate within Cartesian mechanical terms. They operate within much more complex terms, and that's what I'm trying to achieve.
Exactly.
Something parallel to that.
Exactly.
And then the urban place would be, you walk through the city, inevitably, my whole life, I found the things that are most interesting to me are not design things. Yeah. They're the happenstantial things where things collided, came together. It's the, in social terms, it's the cabaret singer. And in the other ones, it's where they crossed through a building and it wasn't designed at all. It was absolutely happenstantial. It's the most interesting thing that occurs, right? Something took place through that collision, through that intersection, through that interference. It became much more interesting than the designed one, which are always banal.
It's fractal, and actually the relationship of the chaos or the control randomness of those internal spaces, or what one experiences there, is no different to what one experiences walking down the street. I mean, in London, as in Atlanta, I was looking out of the hotel window at the Atlanta skyline, and I was thinking, you know, what ordering system has been applied that gives you this? Is it a rational system of controls? Well, in one sense it is, because every single one of those buildings had permits and licenses and laws, and you could do this and you couldn't do that. And yet, in aggregate, you might say, well, it's the usual late 20th century chaotic example of how planning is doomed to failure, if by planning you think that you're going to get a kind of neat set of exact 30-story height things, each with their own individual topping. I mean, this is the myth of planning, isn't it? However, on the other hand, let me put a question to you about this business about the future, because you've both said that what you're designing in the present, you're dealing with the here and now, you're dealing with very contingent circumstances, and you're dealing with the found. And yet there are architects who, not many admittedly, but deliberately say, actually, you can envisage a future. It's just that if you want to pursue that sort of line, the price you pay is that you won't design anything in the present. Archigram being the biggest example, and Cedric Price being a sort of an adjunct to that. And it was precisely because they didn't design in the present that they could speculate about the future. And of course, the interesting thing about that, as a kind of coming in a sort of a loop, is that on the one hand, you can produce autogenetic buildings where you are throwing the dice, but they're your dice, and you're controlling the speed at which they're thrown. But the way they're going to land has got a certain autonomy of its own, which is about as far as you can get from, you know, a mechanical universe to the world of clockwork. Yeah. On the other hand, what Liz is doing these nests on tracks that can come out of their box in 15 minutes flat. And the only digital thing about that will probably be the way that you switch the power on. And beyond that, it could come straight out of the 18th century. Now, those propositions I find both admirable, because it means that we can't do anything other than, in both those instances, say that as those projects become complete, what we get is what either Cedric Price or Rayner Banham, I think both claim credit for this phrase, called the history of the immediate future. Right. It's a forecast, and in that sense, it's a forecast based on the known, and therefore it's not about the future at all. It's about the present.
But the archigram discussion, I think it's more, for me, it's more complicated. I would have said, I've been with, where was I? I was at NARA at a conference like this, and I was sitting with Peter Cook, and Richard Rogers was presenting, and he presented Pompidou. And I'm going, this is going to be interesting.
When was that?
No, this is probably 15 years ago. And I was in Narjman. Well, this is interesting. Richard was phenomenal. First thing came out of his mouth. I'm a builder. I build things. The guy in the front row is the conceptualizer. Right? This is his piece of work. And so I would have said with Peter, people like myself, the problem is superficiality. So I go much thinner because I want to work on ideas. I'm going to build them. And I'm totally aware that out of that comes a certain type of superficiality. The Archigram boys lived the life fully, and they believed in it deeply in a way that very few people will ever get to. Handful of people, architects, will ever reach that, right? And it didn't allow them to build. Well, it didn't allow them to build. It didn't let them personally allow them to build. They formed a whole generation of architects. Grimshaw, Foster, Rogers, you name a whole system. They did the conceptual lifting and had said Price that's right ahead of them or right with them, whispering in their ear. And it's just a matter of a broader historical perspective, whether we do it ourselves. Don't you think? Because I would have said they absolutely are vital. You couldn't imagine any of that work with Archigram, because that's my name came from Archigram. Wolf Frick's Coup Himmelblau came. Well, all of us were looking at that collective practice, the attack of the autonomy of the architect as the individual auteur, on and on. And they formed the 60s. They completely defined the 60s, singularly. Well, throw Super Studio and Hans Rucker, and you can add a few people to that group. And but incredibly powerful in the constructed world. They just didn't themselves construct. If anything, Peter and I talk all the time. It's tough when he wants to build now, because maybe his role in history is set, right? There's no question about what he offered, right?
I suppose the question that I'm asking both of you, really, and I was asking Mac and Alejandro in a different way this morning, is that if the best architects are no longer prepared to speculate or envision or write a manifesto and nail it to a tree about 20 or 30 years' time because of the perceived failure of the modernist project in that respect, it doesn't mean no one's going to do that. It means someone else is going to do it. And I suppose the question is, shouldn't architects be doing this? Shouldn't you actually be saying, well, all those kind of environmental propositions.
But it's happening. I mean, it happens in our everyday practice. The future isn't an end unto itself, right? It's a process, and every project you do, it's an opportunity to do experiments. I mean, even things like material experiments. I mean, they did that in modernism as well. But we don't have to just speculate forward. We use the opportunity of various building projects to propel material experimentation.
And the interrogation of a problem isn't essential to all of our schools.
But problems go backwards and forwards. I mean, I just want to take the culture shed as an example, that it is, it's a kind of old-fashioned idea of just moving parts around with mechanics, but it's a completely contemporary problem of the future of the cultural institution that no longer has sustenance. How do you future-proof, our ability to think openly about, to have independent agendas about things, be able to show them in public space, and not have to work within institutional boundaries that are so tight, with heavy boards and all of that. And those guys don't have money to do anything anyway. So how do you, and maybe it's not so reductive as it has to be the next thing that we don't know what it is yet, but it's someplace out there. It's possible that you use old tools, you kind of think in new ways with old tools, with existing conditions, and something happens to propel, a new idea, which is a cultural manifestation. And if we're if we're successful with that, there might be some life that will liberate us from, the MoMA, and all those institutions which are dying. So there are many ways.
I think a good fire would be helpful in liberating us from.
But it's not about buildings. It's about institution building, and like, what is the institution? In a sense, I mean, doing the hard work of making buildings, that's hard enough in itself. But thinking the institution again and helping, in that, the fact that architects could even be involved in that is just kind of magical. But I think you just have to think in many different ways. And Archigram used paper, and they were like fantastically imaginative. And those examples I give to my students
3,000
today.
projects in 10 years.
Yeah, fantastic production. But it's not about that failed and there's something else, and then it's just it's all part of.
Let me turn it to. I mean, you said something scary to me in the break about if you were teaching today, you would be teaching students to take control over. Basically, you'd be teaching students to do what you were doing. You would turn, let's say, your genius into pedagogy. How do you handle far more complex situations? Put yourself in instrumental roles, participatory roles in the middle of political decisions, economic decisions. In other words, you would basically train students. I think that was exactly the phrase you used, as opposed to teaching students how to understand how to conceptually understand how architects has operated conceptually in terms of its relationships to the present, past, and the future, and how to prepare themselves for unexpected change. So
those are your words, not mine. I don't agree at all.
you said I would train students.
Not train at all. That's your word.
You want to bet? I have it. Okay.
You misquoted it. No, I think that a huge amount of that the schools in the last decade, there's been a direction towards isolation and towards a more and more limited formal problem that I certainly see within my city, and I get around. It's common in many schools. That's not useful, and that if anything, the concentrating on the formal is just about the most dangerous, because nobody is interested in design at that level.
Nobody's interested in formal arguments.
No one's interested, and no one will pay for it. You have to be able to do.
No one's interested in your ability to solve technical problems, because virtually every architect can do that.
No, you have to identify. No, the research has to connect broad conceptual possibilities that are linked to operational strategies which bring it into life, which bring it to reality. That's not everybody, but that's going to be a majority of the profession.
I know, but I mean, basically, your argument that you can solve complex problems, you are increasingly called upon to solve complex problems because your buildings are constantly bigger and more complex, has to do with, presents the false impression, I believe, that there are quite a few architects that can also solve those same problems. But basically, the importance of your architecture is for the effects it produces other than the capacity to solve those problems.
But he's creating new problems.
Yes, that's
that.
I was going to end with this question. This will, Jameson, you'll know.
You don't get the aim until we tell you.
No, I get it. No. Jameson says our role is to throw the present into relief by revealing a future for which the present is an inappropriate past.
Huh? Say that again. Say it one more time.
Got it?
That's good.
Slow down.
Yeah,
Our role as architects is to throw the present into relief by revealing a future for which the present is an inappropriate past.
That's the very definition of critical thinking, that essentially your job is to essentially reveal the present as a cliche.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Exactly. And the question is only in the context of this day, it's how far forward is one looking? Now, I completely acknowledge, actually, the High Line is probably a 20-year project, isn't it? Who knows? It may be completed. Those missing sections may be restored. Who knows? And by definition, many of the buildings that you've done are going to be with us for a very long time indeed. And in that sense, they will be there as a sort of critique of the past at the time